As I'm guessing we're rolling, right? Still waiting for folks. I see people out in the parking lot. We're going to start without them. That's right. Through that window. I just saw a vehicle drive up. Well, I'm grateful that you are here on this glorious Wednesday evening. The Lord's been good to us weather-wise this week, has He not? Man, it's almost tempted to take the Bible study outside. Then the mosquitoes would have, they would be singing Power in the Blood. Yeah, if you need a handout, Miss Julia's delivering. Harold don't write. Hey, did you go to Silsbee? You did, right? Oh, y'all went to Livingston. Okay, go back. We're recording, so I need to be careful how I put this because your teachers may still be watching. So, are y'all high school sweethearts? So, did she do your homework for you? You never did homework, but still graduated. Yeah, there's no hope for Harold. Let's just pass him along. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm just messing with you, Harold. I'm just messing with you. You're a pretty smart guy. Well, it is good to see each of you here this evening. I hope that for those of you that do write, that you picked up a handout and you're going to follow along in our study of Genesis. See, we were in Genesis for so long, I knew I was going to do this. I was going to try to throw you guys a curve and ask you what book of the Bible we were in tonight, but I'm the one that blew it. But we are in the book of Exodus. That's right, Exodus chapter 2. Exodus chapter 2. And by way of introduction, we are going to look at least the beginning part, at least 40 years. This one chapter contains about 40 years of Moses' life, if you can believe that. And we are going to look at his life a little bit, and see what we can learn from his life and how it came about and what the Lord did to protect him. You'll be reminded, though, when we did our overview 2 or 3 weeks ago, that I told you that Moses is mentioned how many times in the Bible? 720, you're right. Over 700 times. And so Barbara Conroe gets the gold star tonight. Okay, I don't know what that'll get you. It may get you to make you pay twice for coffee. I don't know. Okay, all right, well, good for you. 720 times he's mentioned in the Bible. Here's something, another Bible trivia for you Bible trivia buffs. If I were to ask you how many of the 66 books of the Bible would you say that Moses is mentioned in, what would you say? All of them? That would not be correct. Good stab, though. Seth is my hero, okay? He comes up with those great answers. He's mentioned in 31 of the 66 books of the Bible. So think about that. Think about that he's mentioned by the Lord Jesus in the Gospels. He's mentioned by the Apostle Paul in his writings. He's mentioned by John, the Revelator, not in the book of Revelation, but he is mentioned in John's books, the Gospel of John. He is mentioned by Jude, the half-brother of Jesus, in the book of Jude. And I know I'm leaving some others out, but you get the idea. So think about that, 720 times throughout the Bible, 31 of the 66 books of the Bible. But yet, how many times do you think his parents' names are mentioned? Once. Isn't that amazing? Actually, their names are not even mentioned here in the first chapter. We don't find out their names till we get to Exodus chapter 6. And so we'll point that out in just a moment. So think about that. Obviously he has siblings. You think about Aaron, and you may know his sister's name? Miriam. Very good. See, you're on a roll tonight. I'm going to call you Butter. But anyway, you got that, okay? All right, let's look at our study. Actually, that completes our study tonight. You guys are free to go home. Oh, Janice is just walking in. Okay. It wasn't very good. It wasn't very good. Well, let me read verses 1 through 25, and then we'll come back and we will unpack it, okay? This is Exodus chapter 2, beginning in verse 1 through verse 25. Moses writes, and he says, "And a man of the house of Levi went and took as wife a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a beautiful child." Now, let me just pause there. Isn't that what every mother says? Right? I think some of your translations, if you have King James, I think I use the word goodly. When you get over into the New Testament, we'll look at that in just a moment as well. When we get to Acts chapter 7, we're going to look at a little later. I think Stephen is giving his sermon through the Old Testament. He's recapping the Old Testament. I think he uses the term, I think I wrote it down, exceedingly fair. That he was exceedingly fair. So the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. Wonder why she would do that. Verse 3, "But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And his sister," that is this baby's sister, "his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, what did the baby do? The baby cried, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, 'This is one of the Hebrews' children.' Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?' And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Go.' So the maiden went and called the child's mother." Go figure that. "Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages.' So the mother took the child and nursed him." And then verse 10 tells us, "And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, because I drew him out of the water." Now we go into verse 11 through 25. Moses obviously is now a full-grown man. "Now it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. And so he looked this way and that way, and when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 Hebrew men were fighting, and he said to the one who did the wrong, 'Why are you striking your companion?' Then he said, 'Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?' So Moses feared and said, 'Surely this thing is known.' When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water, and they filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Then the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. When they came to Reuel, their father, he said, 'How is it that you have come so soon today?' And they said, 'An Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds, and he also drew enough water for us and watered the flock.' So he said to his daughters, 'Where is he? Why is it that you have left the man? Call him that he may eat bread.' Then Moses was content to live with the man, and he gave Zipporah his daughter to Moses, and she bore him a son, and he called his name Gershom. For he said, 'I have been a stranger in a foreign land.'" Now pay very close attention to verse 23, because this is pretty important. You'll remember in chapter 1, one of the reasons why the Hebrews became the slaves is because the Pharaoh that knew Joseph died, and the new Pharaoh that came to rule, remember what they said about him? He did not know Joseph, did not know the history of Joseph either. So this is that Pharaoh that dies here. Let me watch this, verse 23. Now it happened in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. Then the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage. They cried out, and their cry came up to God because of their bondage. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God did what? Acknowledged them. Now these verses have become very, very important because they springboard us into basically chapters 3 and 4, which we will look at next week. Well, with that introduction by the reading of those first 25 verses, let's begin to unpack this a little bit and talk about it a little bit. Let me think about the first 6 verses when I want to talk about the preservation of Moses. The preservation of Moses. Now, why would we call this the preservation of Moses? Let me remind you that these are some very difficult days for the children of Israel, for the Hebrew people. Now, you don't have to take very long to look back to chapter 1, and I just mentioned this just a moment ago. What verse was that in? Verse 8, chapter 1, verse 8 of the book of Exodus. It says, there rose a new king, that is a new Pharaoh over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And so all the favors, all of the protection that Joseph had provided for his family and the Hebrew people, who really, again, had exploded in population among them. Again, we're probably approaching close to 2 million people by this time in his family. Joseph's died. He died at the end of Genesis chapter 50. Now the Pharaoh that he served under, that showed much love and favor and compassion to him, he has died. A new king has arisen in Egypt who does not know Joseph and is very concerned about this growing population among the Hebrew people. And as a result, he thinks, you know what? We've got to keep our proverbial thumb on them. We've got to keep them suppressed. We've got to keep reminding them that they are our slaves, that if they somehow to join the partnerships or an alliance with our enemies, this could be bad news for us. And so he begins to take matters in his own hands, and he issues the decree. Remember that? That when the Hebrew women, if they were to become pregnant, he would send these midwives, and if they were a boy, what were they to do? They were to kill the boys. If it was the girl, they were to let them live. You remember what happened? We were given the names of 2 of those midwives, and the Bible says that those midwives feared God, and so they would let those boys be spared. And when they came to Pharaoh, Pharaoh got really, really upset about that, and so he sent out, I'm sure, an army to go by the huts of the Hebrew families every day. And if you discover that there is a baby boy among them, what are you to do? We find that back in chapter 1, verse 22. The Bible says, so Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son, so he's telling everybody, not just the midwives now. So Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. Now, what's the significance of being thrown into the Nile River? There were crocodiles that were in there, and you can imagine this would be like feeding them chicken, and I'm not trying to be funny in saying that. You can imagine, I mean, can you imagine just how cruel that is? You know, I think about the culture in that day and the culture of our day. The culture in that day was not very family friendly. Wouldn't you agree with that? And would you agree with me tonight that the culture, the day and age in which we're living is also not very family friendly? I mean, we are paying organizations. When I say we, I'm talking about our government. You'd be amazed at how much money Planned Parenthood makes or gets just from our government to promote and participate in these abortions. And so we are not living in a very family-friendly culture in our day. And so let's begin to look at this. I think there's some things that we can learn about Moses as we think about the preservation of Moses. The very first thing I want to talk to you about, I want you to think with me about the parents. The parents. Look again at verse 1. The Bible tells us, and a man of the house of Levi went and took as wife a daughter of Levi. Now, this would obviously be Moses' dad and Moses' mother. We're going to see in just a moment. Now, we're not given their names here. I think it's interesting. I mentioned to you a while ago that 720 times are they mentioned is Moses mentioned throughout the Bible. 31 of the 66 books of the Bible, Moses is mentioned. But his mom and dad are mentioned by name very, very seldom. So think about it. You've got an unknown mom and dad, so to speak, who have a very famous son. Well, what are their names? Well, we actually are first introduced to their names in Exodus chapter 6. Let's just turn over there. Let me give you their names. Some of you probably have already written those in. Any of you already gotten them written in? Amram and Jochebed. That's exactly right. Look at Exodus chapter 6, verse 20. We're kind of getting the genealogy here a little bit. The Bible says in Exodus 6, verse 20, now Amram took for himself Jochebed, his father's sister, as wife, and she bore him Aaron and Moses. And the years of the life of Amram were 137 years. We also know that he had a sister, or they had a girl, named Miriam, which you mentioned earlier. Okay, so Amram and Jochebed. So I hope that you'd write that in those two blanks as we think about their parents. Okay. All right, Bob, help me out. What's the name Amram mean? Did I hear you just say friend of Most High? You're right. You're exactly right, Bob. You're exactly right. I could have sworn I heard you say friend of the Most High. That's what the name Amram means. And I thought I saw Bob whisper or move his lips to say that Jochebed means Yahweh is glory. Yahweh is glory. Bob, great job. You did your homework. You know I pick on you because I love you. Now think about this. Think about Jochebed and Amram. And think about when your children were born or when you had children come into your life. Do you remember the excitement? I remember Rita and I, we lost our first child back in 1994. This was unknown to me. And I know y'all have heard this story many, many times, that the doctor told us that 50% of all pregnancies end in miscarriage. That really blew me away. I didn't realize the number was that high. But 50% of all pregnancies end in miscarriage. In fact, they give it a medical term. They call it spontaneous abortion. That's the medical term that they use for that. And I remember for months on end that Rita would cry herself to sleep. I could hear her whimpering over there. And I remember praying, God, if we ever have to go through this again, I don't care if we ever have a child. I just don't want to have to go through this again. Well, God was very gracious that we didn't have to go through that again. And in 1995, September of 1995, Chase was born. And I remember being excited but also scared to death. Because I knew nothing about raising a child, let alone one that urinates and poops, right? Let alone one that cries all the time. Chase was our crier. Kyle and Kayla didn't really cry all that much, but Chase just cried nonstop. And so it was a time of great joy. So you would think that this would be a time of great joy for Amram and Jochebed, but I think you'd also know that living under the cultural pressure that they were living in, they were very nervous. Is this going to be a boy or this is going to be a girl? You know, if it's going to be a girl, it's not going to be all that bad. But if it's being a boy, this could turn into a very tragic, tragic moment. Okay? So what should have been a time of joy, no doubt, was a time of fear and anxiety in their lives. So we see not only the parents, but we also see the predicament. And I've already talked about that, so I'm not going to belabor this point. You can see in Exodus chapter 1, verse 22, what caused this. And I'll remind you that, by the way, why were the Hebrew people in the predicament that they were in? Why is it that this Pharaoh was wanting to get rid of all the male children? We kind of already talked about a lot of those things because he did not know Joseph, right? And if I can just spin that a little bit and look at the other side of that coin in our day, and you think about the culture of their day, was not very family friendly, and the culture of our day is also not very family friendly. You want to know why our culture is not very family friendly? It's not because it doesn't know Joseph. It's because it doesn't know God. It doesn't know Jesus. Wouldn't you agree with that? And so how important it is that you and I help our world, that we help our culture get to know Jesus. And so we see their predicament. And I'm not going to belabor that point because I think I've already done that. The third thing I want you to see is not, as we think about the preservation of Moses, not only the parents, the predicament, but the person. Look at verse 2. Verse 2 tells us, this is Exodus 2, verse 2. So the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a beautiful child, again, if you have the King James Bible, I think it uses the word goodly. I think the American Standard uses the word beautiful. And then when you look over in Acts chapter 7, when Stephen is talking about this very event, I think he uses the word that he was exceedingly fair. Now, doesn't every parent think their child is beautiful? Doesn't every parent think that their child is a good child? I mean, the only bad child is somebody else's child, right? At least when they're really, really little. My wife and I thought that about our three, and then we quickly discovered they weren't nearly as goodly as we thought that they were, because we'd look at how well-behaved other people's kids were. We looked what hellions our kids were, right? And so we learned very quickly that our kids weren't as good as we thought that they were, okay? Even though they were all good-looking, right? Because they looked like their mama. But anyway, you get the drift here, right? But when you look at that Hebrew word beautiful, you look at that Hebrew word goodly, or even the Greek word exceedingly fair over there, it's not just the way they look physically, but rather this was, I believe, that he was exceedingly fair and he was beautiful, he was goodly, that he was special in the eyes of God. Because God was going to use him in a very unique and special way to deliver his own people from this bondage and from this culture that was absolutely opposed to anything that God stood for, right? And so what does that tell me and what does that tell you? I want you to write this down somewhere and when you think about under the person. And that is this, that it is God who rules and reigns in the kingdom of men. It is God who raises up. It is God who tears down. And as much angst as we want to put into what happened last November, make no mistake about it, God knows what he's doing. Can y'all say amen to that? Do you believe that? I'm telling you. It is God who raises up. It is God who tears down. It is God who rules and reigns in the kingdom of men. In fact, I remember hearing a story many years ago, and I don't know if this is something I read. Certainly I didn't hear this, but I read it somewhere, that a mother was hearing her little boy on beside his bed one night, and he was on his knees saying his nighttime prayers, and he prayed a prayer like this. He said, "Dear God, please, please, please take good care of yourself, because if anything happens to you, we're going to be in a world of mess." Well, let me tell you something. That kid has nothing to worry about because nothing's going to happen to God. Amen? Because it is God who rules and reigns in the kingdom of men. And I want you... Sure he did, but that's not the point. But he sure did, absolutely. But that's not the point that I'm trying to make. The point that I'm trying to make is that God is God and we are not, and we don't have to worry about anything happening to God. And isn't that a comfort? Isn't that a comfort, right? And so we see not only the parents, the predicament, and the person, but we also see the protection. Look at verse 3. Obviously, Moses is born, and he's not a girl. It's a boy. You look at the last part of verse 2. It says that when she saw that he was a beautiful child, that she hid him for 3 months. And I'm sure that was not an easy task, to kind of keep him out of sight and to keep him quiet, right? Because if I'm sure that they had the Egyptian people walking by those Hebrew huts daily, and she's having to put a pacifier in his mouth or a bottle in his mouth, or however it was that they kept them quiet back then, that they could hear them walking by, okay? But there came a time when the child was no longer able to keep quiet enough that they knew that their cover-up would be exposed. Look what she does, verse 3. I love this. But when she could no longer hide him, that she, that is the mother, took an ark of bulrushes for him and daubed it with asphalt and pitch. Now watch this. And put the child in it and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. So this is not just a basket that she has put him in, but she has literally put him in an ark that has enclosed him. So think about this. Moses is in the river, right? Which is a very dangerous place to be. But where is he? He's in the ark. Watch this. For you and me, you think about Noah, right? Going back to the book of Genesis, he was in the danger of the flood, but he was protected by the ark. Moses was in the danger of the Nile, but he was protected by the ark. You and I are living in a very dangerous culture today. Are we not? We are. I promise you, the day is coming here, even here in these great United States of America, where Christianity will not only not be popular as it is now, it's not popular now, but it could be very dangerous to be called or labeled a believer, right? But here's the neat thing. You and I are in the safety of the ark. Does that mean that you and I cannot be killed? Does that mean that you and I cannot be harmed? The answer to that is no. But we are in the safety of the ark. That, you know what? What happens when we die? We go to glory, right? So we are in the safety of the ark. And all of God's people said, I hope that you are in the safety of the ark. And so we see his protection. His mother has protected him by putting him in the ark. Now you come to verses 4, 5, and 6. We see not only the parents, the predicament, the person, the protection, but we also see the providence. The providence. And when I say providence, I'm talking about the providence of God at work here, because look what happens. Verse 4, and his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Okay, so she's at a distance. She's kind of spying on to make sure that anything bad happens to him. Now watch this. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside, so they're there to protect her as well. And when she saw, and watch this, and when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And now watch this, and when she opened it, she saw the child, and then the baby did something. Well, let me ask you something. What made that baby cry? Could it be that God reached down there and pinched that baby and made that baby cry because he knew that it would tug at the maternal heartstrings of Pharaoh's daughter? Right? I believe with all my heart, when we think about God orchestrating, that's a good word, Jewel, that God is orchestrating this whole thing. And watch this. So she opened it, the baby wept, and now look at the next statement. So she had compassion on him, that is, who's the him? The baby, and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Now again, her father, this Egyptian daughter, the Pharaoh's daughter, her father had already issued a decree that every male is to be thrown into the river. But all she has to do is blink her eyes at her daddy, and her daddy would bow down, right? So look at this, verse 7. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call a nurse for you from among the Hebrew children, or Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you? Now, what an incredible thing that God is doing here. So we see the preservation of Moses. Then beginning in verse 7, we see what I'm going to call the education of Moses. And I believe there are two types of education that are going on here. And I didn't give you this blank to fill in, but maybe you can stick it there at the beginning of this where it says learned. This is not filling in that blank. It's something that goes before it. I want you to see his spiritual education. Let's think about his spiritual education. So think about how God has arranged this protection or this preservation over Moses. Not only would he be born, right, but he would tug on the heartstrings of Pharaoh's daughter, and that Moses' sister would just happen to be there, would say, hey, by the way, would you like me to have somebody take care of this baby until he's old enough for you to take care of? I may know somebody, right? And so she gives that decree. Here's what I like about this. It says in verse 9, verse 8 rather, and Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. We think about a mother's wages. So here was a mom who was giving her baby back, and she was paid to take care of her own baby. How about that? Again, you see the providence of God here taking place. So think about this. When you go to, we've not to verse 10 yet, but verse 10 says, and then finally the child grew to be old enough that he was taken to be the son of Pharaoh's daughter. But think about all of this, the tutelage and the formidable years that he was going to be under the influence of his mother. And I think about the spiritual education that he's getting. And I think there were two primary things that his mother, talking about Moses' mother, invested in him. And number one, I think, is that she reminded him, and you're going to see this once we get to verse 11 and 12, you're going to see that I believe, and I think that you're going to see this too for yourself, that Moses spent a lot of time teaching Moses to learn who he was. That is, he's a Hebrew. Now, he's going to go live under the influence of Pharaoh. He's going to learn the Egyptian culture. But I believe in those formidable years, his early years, where he could be trained and taught, that his mother spent a lot of time teaching him who he was. Hey, you're a Hebrew. You may go live over there, but you're one of us. And you're going to see this because when he sees those two, the Egyptian and the Hebrew fighting, who does he kill? He kills the Egyptian. Why? Because he sees one warring with who he is, right? But not only was she spending a lot of time teaching him who he was, but more importantly, she learned him who God was, or who God is, I should say. Who God is, right? Hey, you are a child of Elohim. You are a child of the Creator God. You are a child of Yahweh. You are the one true Lord. You are a child of God. You are part of the people of God, right? But not only that, and I wish we had time to look at this, but not only did he have a spiritual education, again, learning who he was and learning who God was, but I think during this time that when he went in verse 10, when he goes to be Pharaoh's daughter's son, that's what verse 10 says, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son, and she called his name Moses, saying, because I drew him out of the water. By the way, that's what the name Moses means. It means to pull out or to draw out. Now, we absolutely do not know how old he was when he left the household of his biological parents and became the son of Pharaoh's daughter. We don't know how old that was. We could just speculate at best. But here's what we do know. When you look at Acts chapter 7, and we'll look at this in just a moment, here's what the Bible says, that Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. That he was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. So not only did he have a spiritual education that his mom invested in him, that is who he is, you're a Hebrew, you're part of the children of Israel, and who God is, you are a child of God. But he also got involved in the culture and the wisdom and the education, as far as the secular education goes, in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. Now, let me understand something. If you trace a lot of the developments that we've seen, even in our world, you can actually trace it back to Egypt. They were some incredibly smart people. I mean, it's incredible. And so he learned all of that. So don't think for a second that Moses was some country bumpkin. No. He was a very well-learned young man, okay? So we see not only the preservation of Moses and the education of Moses. Now we begin to look at verses 11. As a matter of fact, where it said verse 12 through 22, put 11. I left out verse 11. I want to skip that. I want you to think with me about the evasion of Moses, because look what happens in these verses 11 through 22. Now it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, and he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens, and he saw the Egyptian beating a Hebrew. Now watch this, one of his what? Brethren. Well, how did he know this was one of his brethren? Again, going back to what his mom taught him in those early years. So what did he do? He looked to the left, he looked to the right, so to speak, and when he saw that no one was there, he killed the Egyptian and he hid him in the sand. Well, he's thinking, you know what? I've delivered one of my own people, okay? And I've gotten away with it. I've killed an Egyptian. Well, that old saying is, be careful, your sin will find you out. That is true, because the very next day, look what happens. He thought no one was looking, but the very next day, we're told, in verse 13, and when he went out the second day, behold, 2 Hebrew men were fighting. Now you've got 2 Hebrews fighting amongst themselves. And he said to the one, hey, who did the wrong, why are you striking your companion? Why are you beating up on your comrade, so to speak? And then watch verse 14. Then he, that is this other Hebrew, said, hey, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? And I can almost hear that sound from, I forget, it's one of those TV shows, dun, 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 right? He's gotten exposed, right? He thought that he'd gotten away with it, but now he had not. Somebody had actually seen him kill the Egyptian. Yeah, and so I'm glad you brought this up, Holly, because I was going to bring this up, because he had the right to do it, right? Huh? But the fact that he hid it, that's exactly right. Here's the problem. That's exactly right, because he was an Egyptian. He had a right. He was a high-ranking person in Pharaoh. Again, he would be considered the grandson of Pharaoh here. So he would be considered a prince. So he had that authority to do that if he saw fit. But the fact that he covered it up has become the problem. That's exactly right. I'm sure that he probably told them, okay, and then again you think, well, they're asking, well, who made you a prince over us? Who made you a judge over us, right? So they kind of recognize that, right? And then you look at verse 14, who made you, latter part of verse 14, it says, and so Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known, and surely it was, because you look at verse 15, when Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian and sat down there by a well. Now hold your finger there and go with me. I told you we're going to go to Acts chapter 7. There's some things in Acts chapter 7 that Stephen records for us, or that Stephen shares with us in his Old Testament 101 sermon that he gives, that I want to point out to you that I think is very significant. Let's begin in verse 17. Acts chapter 7, verse 17. You're there, tell me you're there. Acts 7:17 says this, but when the time of the promise drew near, okay, now this is Stephen. He's given his sermon. They've accused him of being a traitor. They've accused him of some dastardly things, and at the end of his sermon, they're basically going to stone him, okay? And look what happens here. But when the time of the promise drew near, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt, till another king arose who did not know Joseph. So he's recapping Exodus chapter 1 for us. Huh? Somebody say something? He's recapping Exodus chapter 1. Okay, he's talking about the Pharaoh being raised who did not know Joseph. Okay, we're going to get to chapter 2. Verse 19, this man dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our forefathers, making them expose their babies so that they might not live. And at this time, now we get to chapter 2, and at this time Moses was born, and now watch this, and was well-pleasing to God. Okay, some of your translations may use the word exceedingly fair to God. And he was brought up in his father's house for 3 months. But when he was set out, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and brought him up as her own son. And Moses, and here's me telling you about this, about his secular education. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. Now here's what I want you to make a note of, verse 23. Now when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed and struck down the Egyptian. For he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand, but they did not understand. The next day he appeared to two of them that were fighting and tried to reconcile them, saying, men, you are brethren. Why do you wrong one another? But he who did this did this to his neighbor, wrong pushed him away, saying, "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you did the Egyptian yesterday?" Verse 29 says, "Then at this saying, Moses fled and became a dweller in the land of Midian, where he had 2 sons." And then look at verse 30. "And when 40 years had passed, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire." And that's when we're going to see that in chapter 3, "in a bush in the wilderness of Mount Sinai." So watch this. So that tells us 2 things right off the bat. That he spent the first 40 years of his life in Egypt. Okay? The first 40 years of his life in Egypt. The next 40 years of his life would have been spent in Midian. Okay? This is where we are in the middle of chapter 2 of the book of Exodus. And so you would say up until the time that he killed the Egyptian and the next day that he fled because he felt like they'd been exposed, he's roughly 40 years age, right? Until the time that the next Pharaoh dies, or this Pharaoh dies, he's now 80 years of age, okay? And then he'll spend the next 40 years delivering the children of Israel from the bondage of Egypt, even getting them back and marching them to the promised land to where he disobeys and is not able to do that. So he lived to be 120 years. And I think here's the point I want to make to you tonight. If he lived 120 years, to be 120 years, the Bible tells us that he did, and he spent the first 80 of his years learning before he led. Think about that. For every year that he led, he spent 2 years learning. Now let that sink in for a little bit. For every year that he led, he spent 2 years learning. What does that say about us? Well, go back to our text. Y'all are awfully quiet tonight. And so I want you to write that down under the evasion of Moses. I want you to do 40/40/40. So you'd kind of divide up his life into 3 stages. Those first 40 years in Egypt, the second 40 years in Midian, and then the last 40 years leading the children of Israel out of Egypt. Okay, I say Egypt and beyond, I should say. Well, let's move on to the 4th and final thing here, because I'm out of time anyway, almost. Let me finish reading where we are. We're told that, in fact, you look at what he did when he got to Midian in verse 16. It says, "Now the priest at Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water, and they filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Then the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock." So what is he doing here? He's being a servant, but he's also being a protection, right? He's being a deliverer. So you've got these shepherds who are coming to be mean to these women who are also trying to feed their flock and trying to scoot them away, like, you don't have a right to this before we do. And so what does Moses do? He stands up to them to protect them. So he's already got that deliverer mentality, so to speak, that God has put in his heart, and God's going to use him, right? Verse 18, when they came to Ruel, they tell him what happens. When they came to Ruel, their father, he said, "How is it that you have come so soon today?" Because he knew that they would probably be pushed back and have to wait their turn. "How is it that you're back so soon?" Well, here's what they say. Verse 19, "And they said, an Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds, and he also drew enough water for us and watered the flock." And so he, that is Ruel, says to his daughters, "Well, where's this guy? Why is it that you have left that man? Call him that he may eat bread." Look, we need to have fellowship with this guy. I need to show him hospitality as he has shown you hospitality. And then we're told in verse 21 that Moses was content to live with the man. In fact, the man gave him one of his daughters, a woman by the name of Zipporah, gave his daughter to Moses, and they have a child together, and she bore him a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, "I have been a stranger in the foreign land." And then you look at verses 23, 24, and 25. We see that 4th thing about that we can learn from the life of Moses, and that is this. We see the consolation by God. The consolation by God. Now look what happens here. I think you see 2 major things here. Verse 23 says, "And it happened in the process of the time that the king of Egypt died." Now why is that important? He is, but why is it important as far as it relates to Moses? That's right. Remember that? He had heard that Moses had killed an Egyptian over a Hebrew. And so, you know what? Moses, this is not right. I'm out to get you. I'm gonna have you killed, right? That's just kind of how corrupt and mean-spirited he is. And so it's kind of like, if you remember, there's some parallels when you think about the life of Moses and the life of Jesus when they were born. You ever thought about the parallels there? So think about when Moses was born, he had to be hidden because Pharaoh wanted to kill him. When Jesus was born, you had Herod because he wanted to kill all of those babies that were 2 years and younger, right? Remember that? And in fact, remember, God told Joseph, that is Jesus' earthly father, told him, hey, flee to Egypt until Herod is dead. Remember that? And then after Herod died, he was able to come back. And the same thing is true about the life of Moses. Now, don't walk out of here thinking tonight that I'm telling you that Moses was co-equal to Jesus. Because we think about the similarities of the life of Moses and the life of Jesus, I can assure you that when you come to the end of their life, you see a radical difference. And that is, Moses was a sinner, just like you and me, and Jesus was completely without sin. Just as Moses delivered his people, Jesus delivered his people along with you and me. The difference is that Jesus lived a sinless life, and all of God's people said. Well, look at this. So, there's the good news, at least for Moses' sake. Now, it happened in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. Now, watch this. Then the children of Israel, what did they do? They groaned. Why? Why are they groaning? Because of the bondage. It's not just that they're in slavery. Slavery is bad enough as it is. But they are being suppressed. They are being oppressed. Their lives are literally being made miserable. And they are groaning. And God's looking down upon this. And God sees this. And God hears this. In fact, we're told that the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage. And they cried out. Now watch this. And their cry came up to God because of the bondage. But God, notice this in verse 24, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob, and God looked. So God didn't just hear, but God also saw, looked upon the children of Israel, and watch this. I love this. Underscore this. And God acknowledged who? Them. That God's going to do something about their situation. And when you think about the consolation to God, there are two things that I want you to notice. Verse 23, I want you to see God's compassion. And you've heard me define the word compassion many, many times. The word compassion literally means, is a combination of two words. The word com, meaning to come along with, and the word passion meaning to suffer. So the word compassion means to suffer along with. So when God looked upon their groaning and their oppression and their suppression, God was moved by that. He groaned as well, or he was moved by that with compassion. And so God loved them, and he was moved to action. But not only that, look what happens in verse 24. And God heard the groaning, and God remembered the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Again, remember the covenant that he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Was it conditional or unconditional? It was unconditional. It was not conditional upon them doing something. It was conditional on God doing something, and God remembered that. And it's not that he said, oh, man, I forgot about that. No, it's just that God says, you know what? I made a promise to them that I intend to keep. And then verse 25 says, and God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them. That is, he acknowledged their predicament, and he's getting ready to move in a very, very powerful way because he's going to use this same Moses that was flawed, this same Moses that was a murderer, this same Moses that had many, many flaws in his life. He's going to use him in a very powerful way to deliver his own people from this bondage called the Egyptian bondage. Questions or comments? No, God's compassion and God's covenant. I thought I said it. I'm sorry. Say it again. It had to be a C. Yeah. It's my OCD kicking in. But not all of these points are alliterated, though.
Yeah, and David, Moses and David both killed him.
Yeah.
Yeah, so.
Yeah.
But yet God protects them and
And if God can use people like that, then that means he could use people like you and me.
That's right.
Right?
That's our hope.
Right.